This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Red Desert, the Michelangelo Antonioni classic film, and I have two experts who will be talking about it. The subject is Red Desert, the great film by Antonioni, and I have two people who will be discussing it. At the top of your screen, I have Sławomir Maslan, and on the bottom of the screen, I have David Forgach. As I usually like to do, I want to give both of my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves. So, Sławomir, let me start with you. Can you give a little background about who you are, your interest in films, and any opening thoughts you have about Antonioni and this film in particular?
Uh, I don't know. I teach literature and film and I don't know, theory of culture and things like this in this little university. I mean, it's not little actually, but kind of provincial university in Poland, Upper Silesia. I don't know. I just like it. I'm not a specialist in Italian culture like David Fogach is, and I just like Antonioni. And I don't know what I can say as an introduction to this film. It's the first film in color made by Antonioni, and the last film with Monica Vitti, and it's, in a certain sense, it's an unusual film because it's kind of the middle between these three black and white film with Vitti, but it's not very much like these previous films. And it's also the last film with a female lead role, I would say, yes. And the last film in Italian, I mean, not the last film in Italian, but the last film in Italian before a big hiatus in Italian. I mean, in his films in Italian. I don't know.
Okay, David Forgach, if you could give a little background about yourself, your interest in this film.
Yeah, well, maybe I should start by saying I saw this film as a very young person. I think I was 13, and my father took me to it when it came out or when it was released in London. So that's kind of my age, really. That must have been 1967, probably. And no, probably 66, yeah. And being the young kind of arty nerd that I was at that age, I thought it was a wonderful film. I didn't really understand it, but I was fascinated by the fact it was kind of semi-abstract. Didn't have much of a story, really. I didn't really follow the story. But I was really enamored of those industrial landscapes. And in some ways it formed my idea about Italy. When I was older and I studied and then I became kind of interested in modern Italy, I was much more attracted to the industrial Italy and the Italy of workers and factories that you see in Red Desert than the heritage Italy of, Florence and Rome and paintings. It was kind of part of me that wanted to really identify with that, modernizing Italy. So that's my kind of biographical connection with it. And then, now for a long time now, I've been teaching modern Italian history and culture. I do quite a lot of work on cinema. I love Antonioni too. I don't really claim any more expertise than anybody else can acquire just by reading about him, seeing the films, enjoying the films. I did once have a conversation on the phone with Tonino Guerra, who was the co-screenwriter of this film, who told me a little bit of background about it, but otherwise I have no particular, connection with Antonioni. Anyway, but I'm very happy to talk about this film. I mean, as we've said, it's his first film in colour. It's a kind of experiment with colour. It's a very daring colour film. He's using all the possibilities of colour cinematography that you can imagine in 1964. So maybe, to me, what's interesting about the film is it's both a narrative. It does tell a story. Unlike what I thought when I was young, I can see there's a narrative there. But it's also a kind of exploration of colour and form and shape and the abstraction of the moving image. So that's the kind of fascination of it for me. It's both those things at once.
To me, it seems like a transitional film. Sławomir had brought up what some people in the U.S. here call the Alienation or the L'Alienation trilogy with the L's, L'Avventura Note and Leclerc, and some people add this as a fourth one. But to me, it seems stylistically, not just because it's a color film, but it seems different. There's sort of a synesthetic appeal that the color has in concert with the music. This film deals specifically with Vidi's character as someone who's mentally off. We don't know if he's truly mentally ill, but there's something wrong with her. Whereas with the other three films, we're talking about sort of general ennui, boredom with modern life, then modern life. And this seems to be a more clinical film in certain ways. Would you agree with that, David?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't really like the idea of talking about a trilogy or tetralogy. I mean, that was obviously critics after Antonioni made that kind of grouping of his films. I don't know if he necessarily thought about these films as a group. But it's true that it's got some connections with the films he made before, L'Avventura and La Notte l'Eclisse. It kind of pushes in the same direction towards a kind of semi-abstraction. It is a film about this woman's mental state, undoubtedly. I mean, the centre of the story is really that Giuliana, played by Monica Vitti, has crashed a car. At the beginning, you think the crash causes her mental health problem, but it's clear in the narrative that actually she had that before, and it may have even been a suicide attempt. So there's a kind of enigma around her. You know, what is her problem? How did she get to be with that? Is she unhappy in the marriage with Ugo? Is she unhappy as a mother? That's not explained, but there is this kind of mystery of her mental state. I think what is clear in the film is she doesn't feel comfortable in that industrial environment. It seems to me the film is very much about her kind of disconnect between her as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, and that world of hard industry and, you know, metal and gasoline and, you know, petroleum and all those things that are being produced there. She doesn't connect with that. And the film is a little bit about that, very much about that disconnect, I think. I don't know if Slavomir, if you agree with that.
I don't entirely agree with that, and that's actually what for me is the interest of this film. This is like traditional take to this film, and actually Antonioni also spoke about this, like that, you know, that she is this woman that is different from everybody else because she doesn't fit in or whatever. And I don't really see this film in such a way because, first of all, she is not the only character in the film that doesn't fit in. You know, there is this. She and this Corrado, they go to Medicina to look for this worker, and it turns out later on that she knew this worker from the clinic, or mental clinic, in which she spent some time and so on and so forth. And I don't really think that this connection between Juliana's, it's never called depression. They didn't use this word at that time, or very rarely, in the 60s. Now it's like the civilizational disease in the 21st century, like everybody has it, right? And I don't really think that this connection between, on the one hand, this industrial poison all over the place, let's say, right? And her clinical depression, or whatever we can call this, right? That it's accidental and that it's just her and everybody else fits in the situation really well, because I don't really see this film in such a way, right? So I can't say that I agree with that too much, at least.
Okay, well, it's good to have a difference of opinion on it. I mean, I've always read the film, or at least since I've been seeing it as an adult, I've read the film in that way. It's about, the woman who doesn't fit. You're right, the worker who's been in the same clinic also has problems with fitting in. He doesn't want to go to Patagonia, he doesn't want to travel, he wants, he's unhappy with the situation. So, yeah, you may be on a
So it's more like a civilizational issue, or, capitalism at this point, perhaps, in Italy, or wherever. I mean, I see it from this angle, let's say.
Could it be that she suffers from the old-fashioned term of melancholy, which doesn't have the negative implications necessarily of modern depression? I mean, she realizes that this is not the life that she wants. She has sort of here and there kind of relationship with her son. She doesn't. She's in a marriage that seems to be sort of dead. And the other people in the film, like Corrado, like her husband, like this worker, they seem to be, in some sense, behind her curve, in that they don't realize how dead ended. I mean, her husband is sort of a soulless, industrial capitalist or something. What about the melancholy versus the modern depression thing? Either of you.
I think that's very interesting. I mean, that's not a kind of modern analytic, sort of a diagnostic category, but it may well work for her. All I know is that in interviews, when he wrote about the film, and also when Monica Vitti talked about it, the word they used was neurosis, which is again not a term used now. I think you'd call it an anxiety disorder. So their understanding was that she has an anxiety disorder. What it's called, what it comes from, it's not clear. But it's that she's clearly behaves differently from the others who are more integrated with that world. Melancholy, it does have some aspects of kind of early modern melancholy to it, I think. Yeah.
Sławomir?
Yeah, but I think melancholy. I mean, in the 20th century and the 21st century, it's like what is simply now called depression. All those sort of positive connections with melancholy. Well, we can go to the 16th century or 17th century, but it doesn't really work anymore in this way, I think. So this is one thing. But another is that, what we see in the film as, let's say, clinical picture, that would be very far from neurosis. That would be depression, out and out depression, I would say. But that's, of course, another story. But yet another kind of difference between her and the rest of the world around her is, it's like she's like the only person among these, in her circle, let's say, right, that she keeps returning to this point that she needs others. She cannot be like this individual's kind of, separated from others, but everybody else, we've got this capitalist individualism. And this is one of the issues, I think, that is brought into it. And, one of the differences that also has some kind of background, I guess, or is some kind of background to, her depression. Like, there is this famous point in the film that says, she would like to have all those people who love her as a wall around her, right? So some kind of collective spirit. There is no collective. I mean, apart from the strike at the beginning, which is only sort of mentioned, right? And it kind of disappears later on the film, We've got this sort of new individualist, capitalist, post-Fordist Italy, right? And I think it's in the background, and again, I think it's not unrelated to this industrial poison that we see all the time in the film. So that's what I can add.
How about the film's cinematography? Because it seems that the characters are disconnected from the natural world, not the real world, but the natural world. There's that shitty cabin that a handful of them go to. It's falling apart. You look at the giant smokestacks that are belching fire and whatnot. They look, and in the interior of the mechanical plant that Vitti's character's husband works in, it almost looks like the inside of something from some science fiction movie, like the belly of some starship. And it seems to me these characters are disconnected from the natural world, and that might be also a part of what they are suffering. It's got sort of this bleak, neo-futurist, or maybe just futurist then, feel to it. What do you think? What are your thoughts on the imagery of that, David?
I have a slightly different take on this. I mean, I don't disagree with the reading of the film is showing these kind of dysfunctional aspects of modernity and capitalist modernity. But I think it also, you also need to take into account that Antonioni made all these positive statements about industrial modernity. He found it exciting. He found it visually exciting. He loved to see the colours of factories. He liked the way it had sort of taken over the landscape. And I think that love of its colour is there in the film. So at most, I would say the film is ambivalent about this world. It's not simply a critique of it. It's about how has this world transformed Italy. There are people who fit in with it, and there are people who don't fit in with it. And Antonioni, I don't feel, I just don't read this as a kind of dystopian critique of industrial modernity. I think it's more ambivalent than that. That links to the cinematography. I mean, I think the colour photography does register those exciting colours, those vibrant colours. From the opening sequence where it's all kind of out of focus, it turns into a kind of abstract painting. There's the music, the electronic music, and it's and the singing of Cecilia Fusco's voice, and you get this kind of overture of the film, which is about colour and the colorization of that landscape. And that comes back at various points when they go and see the radio telescope in Medicina. That's also this beautiful structure with these red gantries and things. So there is the other side of it. There's a bit where they see all the pollution, all the dirt, and that's a kind of, if you like, a kind of ecological critique of the other side of modernity. It does generate waste and dirt and pollution. But I see him very much as somebody who's playing around on the edge of that, on the complexity of that modernity. And I think, to me, to read it simply as a kind of critique of a sort of polluted modernity is slightly to misread it, or at least to kind of impose a later grid on it. We're much more, I think, from the 80s and 90s, people become much more aware of the kind of depredations of capitalism on nature. Capitalism is destroying nature, it's eating it up, it's changing the climate, it's ruining the landscape. I think in a slightly earlier phase, we're talking about the very early 60s, there's a lot of excitement about the positive potential positive impact of industrial modernization in a country like Italy that had been very poor up until the 1950s. So I don't see him purely as standing on one side of this. I think the film is kind of laying out that ambivalence to us. I get a sense that Sławomir is not going to read it the same way as me, but that doesn't really matter. I think you presumably want two different takes on the film, but my take is very much on that side of the ambivalence.
Sławomir?
Of course, David is absolutely right. Antonioni himself, he, in interviews, he spoke a lot about sort of like excitement and so on, but I don't really see this in the, that was his opinion, and I don't know, he perhaps wanted to somehow insert this in the film, but, and obviously I'm looking at this film from, the perspective of the 21st century, although I'm kind of old enough to remember the, earlier days too. But I don't really see this ambivalence in the film. If you think about even the way he sort of like colors the factory, where Hugo worked, Ugo, the husband of Juliana, works, right? We're talking about the 60s, and this is a petroleum plant or something like this, right? There is a famous fragment from one of the interviews relating to this film. One of the interviews with Antonioni, in which he speaks about this excitement that modernity put colors everywhere and so on and so forth. Well, yes, but how? By producing plastic. This is 1950s invention, just like recent invention before this film, right? And this film, as David said, it starts with this fairy tale images, like the credit, the opening credit section is like this voice that you've mentioned, and this blurred image, and the factory looks like Hagia Sophia, or like some kind of huge church actually, with cupolas and stuff. Like these are silences, of course, and things like this, but it looks like fairy tale. Right? Then, of course, after cut, we are sent into this post-apocalyptic kind of imagery when Juliana and the boy appear, and it's all is mud and industrial poison and so on and so forth. So actually, obviously these two sides between which Antonioni, or the film actually, switches. But I know I would go for this, I don't know, let's call it ideological interpretation that, we've got this colorful side, which a certain kind of discourse presents to everybody, how exciting everything is, right? And this film is also about excitement. Anxiety is one of, like all modern civilization is about individual excitement, right? Anxiety is also hyper exciting, you can say, right? In a certain kind of way. On the one hand, all these colorful images, literally colorful, but also enticing, right? But on the other hand, if you just scratch the surface, it's just this poison, and not necessarily industrial poison in the sense of ecological, in an ecological sense. It's like, for me, this industrial poison is also some kind of, like mental landscape in this film. And by the way, there is, as far as I remember, I saw this film yesterday, preparing for this program, let's say, whatever. There is only one image in the entire film, I think, which is kind of, let's call it naturalistic, like normal colors and so on. And it isn't framed. It's like the moment where Juliana enters this hotel, Corrado's hotel, towards the end of the film. The hotel lobby is all painted white, including the plants, like there are ficuses and stuff, right? And this white, within this white, there is this huge window into the street. And I think this is the only moment in the film when we see the word in its sort of like more or less naturalistic or natural colors, or, and everything else is transformed by Antonioni somehow, including, flattening everything out. Like this film is very claustrophobic for this reason that either you've got these, in early Antonioni's films, everything is in perfect focus. It doesn't matter where it's located in front of the camera, right? This is also the first film in which this goes away completely. And either we've got, shallow focus, right? Or even if we don't have these blurry images, it's the telephoto lens is used, so everything is sort of like flattened out, right? Okay, that's
so. I wanted to just mention, I didn't mean to imply that this film is dystopian. I think the imagery of the film, the music, the cinematography espouses estrangement, or in Juliana's case, maybe derangement, sort of like Arthur Rimbaud and that kind of thing. And I say this because she's clearly a character who has issues, we would say in the modern parlance. She's not all there mentally, but yet in that bravura scene that you mentioned about the Astrale, the girl on the beach, her son is pretending to be sick so he can skip out on school for the day, and she's over the top worried. And yet this woman with this deranged mind comes up with this wonderful metaphor of a story that you wouldn't think she's capable of. The girl is on the beach. There's a boat in the distance. She swims out to it. It's a ghost ship. It goes away, and then she's back on the beach. It ends, and then nature itself starts singing. We get the song Astrale. So it seems to me that that Juliana is someone who, like I mentioned earlier, has a bit more going in her tank. She just seems to be lost. She recognizes whatever is missing in her life, and it doesn't have to be that it's the society. It could be what's missing inside of her that she doesn't fit in. do you agree that the film sort of portrays her in a sense as a savant in some ways, especially given that little passage on the beach with the story she tells her son? Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, can I say something about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure about a savant, but I mean, certainly she's kind of projecting a fantasy of what she'd like. And in fact, I know that Antonioni, in one of the interviews about it, says that this is a moment where her, yeah, I think, sorry, if I can just remember it, he said the sequence shows reality as Juliana would like it to be, different from the world which around her, the world of Ravenna, the industrial landscape, which is monstrous. So, you know, on the one hand, this fantasy world, which of course is a real landscape. I mean, it's shot in a little island off Sardinia, which really had pink sand. So this little idyllic, you know, kind of treasure island kind of fat child's fantasy is the alternative to that world. And it's also, I think, the only part of the film where he didn't manipulate the color. We can talk about that because you asked about the cinematography, but I mean, the color is often manipulated in the film either by putting filters over the lens or by pulling out of focus to create these blurred images, or by painting, actually spraying painting on the landscape, you know, painting the grass or painting that street, Via Alighieri in Ravenna, which is grey. He paints the fruit on a vendor's barrow, which is all grey. So, you know, this is the one sequence where he said, I didn't manipulate the colour at all. It was all shot in daylight. We didn't use filters. We just shot, you know, natural Technicolor sequence. So I think it's important, yeah, the one part which is, if you like, set in nature, uninterfered with by industry, is the one where she's kind of imagining being out of that world. And that would certainly fit with the kind of the reading of the film that Slavomir is giving, I think, which is, you know, the world that she's in is dysfunctional. It's, you know, a depredation of nature and so on. But I think it would also fit with the other reading, which is, you know, there are two kinds of reality that Antonioni finds fascinating. One is the reality transfigured by industry and by these kind of bright colours planted on the ground, and the other is the reality that hasn't been adulterated in that way. And both those realities are presented in the film. So it comes back, you know, I'm trying to sort of say that my reading also can incorporate this sequence.
Slavomir, what is your take on that beach sequence with the little girl?
As usual, I would like to subvert it a bit. Actually, starting with David Forgage's his own comments on, you know, this British Film Institute release of the film. There is a commentary by David there, and where he says that, well, what he said already, plus there is something else that, and everybody can see this in the film, that, well, okay, in the film they say that this, you know, Juliana says that the sand is pink, but in the film it isn't pink because it didn't register in Technicolor. And there is another funny, I don't know, perhaps it's not funny, but, you know, another kind of thing that perhaps subverts this idea that this is some kind of, you know, like paradise or something, is like, there's this short fragment when the rabbit appears on the beach. And the rabbit just goes crazy. He jumps into the water, and, you know, it looks as if it's drowning or something like this. Right? And I don't really think this. And I can also. There is this book by William Arrowsmith on Antonioni's films, and he considers this fantasy as poisonous, and I'm very much in agreement with him. I mean, at least in many respects. And it can also be somehow supported in the film, I guess, by, you know, there is no pink sand in the film. I mean, it was pink, supposedly, in this little, you know, on this little island, but it's not there in the film. In the film, it's not pink. But there is this scene in which everything is painted pink, of course. And this is after this excruciating scene of, you know, like sex between Corrado and Juliana. And I know some people, some critics, wrote about the scene as some kind of relief. I don't know. I think they must have been blind or something looking at the scene, because nothing even remotely in the scene suggests any kind of relief, right? And so I think that this pinkiness of the scene of the last shot, let's say, of the sequence, right, where everything is painted pink after they have sex, would somehow reflect back on this image of the island not very favorably. I have a longer theory about this, but I don't know, perhaps we don't have enough time to explain that.
Well, it seems to me that in that sex scene, there's a sort of fetishism with Vidi's body that's a direct throwback to the rocks, because the rocks look like the curves of a woman's body.
And it's also a direct throwback to this cabin scene, this cabin painted flaming red, when these women's bodies are fragmented. There is a mirror there in the shack too. And the women's bodies are fragmented in the same, or in a very similar way in which Viti's body is fragmented in this later scene.
Yeah. So let's sort of just go through a rough outline of what happens in the film. We talked about Ugo and Juliana. They're in a marriage of ennui, you want to call it. Corrado comes. He's with some company that does some kind of, it seems like, energy exploration. They're planning something down in Patagonia, and it seems that Corrado is supposed to be the other main figure, more so than the Ugo character. The interesting thing that I find about his character is it's so apart from the character that Richard Harris, who plays Corrado, so far apart from the role that he played in This Sporting Life, which he was this volcano, this sort of Marlon Brando-esque character. And here he's straitjacketed into this role. And in some ways, I think he sort of miscast. It's the role. It's the one character that I think I don't know if it is the best. If he was the best actor for that role. Just briefly, both of you. I'll start with you, Sławomir. What is your take on Harris and his performance here?
Actually, because he was perhaps miscast. I mean, there are all those stories about the problems between Antonioni and him. But actually, I think that this, if we call it miscasting, I mean, it worked in the sense that he's supposed to be this like totally lost guy, in a sense. Although he's this sort of like romantic capitalist. That's another story. So this sort of like, I think that this feeling that you've just described about Harris being out of, I don't know how to call it in English, out of his depth or whatever. I know English is not my native language. Actually, it works because this sort of like lostness and so on fits this film actually.
David?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think for once we completely agree with this. I wouldn't call it miscasting either. I think he probably wasn't very happy with that. We know he wasn't happy working on that film or with his performance, but I think it's just right for the film. He's this kind of muscular guy who's kind of walks around in a suit and looks a bit lost. Which is, I think, exactly what they wanted for the film.
So, other than the beach scene with the girl, sort of the other big symbolic scene is this scene at this red shack. And the shack seems to be at the edge of a river that could be a toxic waste dump if you go forward a couple of decades. It seems crap. You can imagine that 50 years earlier it was a paradise, and now it seems to be have fallen into ruin, just like the shack was probably a nice little getaway for a family in the 19-teens or something.
There is another shack which is exactly shown like this. There is this shack owned by Ugo and Juliana, and they go to this shack before they go to this red shack, let's say. and they say that, I mean, Ugo says something like that he used to go fishing there, but it's like completely polluted and poisoned and so on. So now there's this other shack, which is also kind of important, and nobody notices it.
And later on,
zebras inside. I mean, the kind of wallpaper or painting of zebras inside, also kind of creepy.
And later on in the film, there's the fact that the ship is quarantined there. So this area along that riverfront or whatever, which is probably less than a half a mile between or whatnot, there's something wrong. It almost reminds me of Stalker, Tarkovsky's film. That this is an area that is the forbidden zone if you want to go to the planet of the apes. David, what is your take about the cabin scene, the red cabin scene, and also the later quarantine, that this is an area that's just hellbound?
Yeah, I mean, I've always found that a strange sequence. The first time I saw the film, I mean, not as a teenager, but later on, the first time I saw it as a real adult, I didn't like it. I found it annoying. It went on for a long time. What are they doing playing these sex games? But it's interesting in the way it's paced. I think the rhythm of that sequence is very interesting because it keeps getting punctuated by Juliana either hearing a sound that the others don't hear or seeing something. As you say, in this little space of the bright red hut, it's surrounded by things that are dangerous. There's either the kind of this polluted swamp on the one side, or there's this ship where they're running up the yellow flag because they've got some contagion on board. So you create a space where these people are playing these rather loose kind of sexual games, talking about quail's eggs and their aphrodisiac properties. And on the other hand, there's Juliana kind of sensing an outside, which is encroaching on that. And that menacing kind of outside is very interesting. I think, to me, that's the real tension in the scene between these people playing these games inside and, boxed in, if you like, and her sensing something going on outside. As if she's got this kind of preternatural kind of sensitivity to things around her.
Sławomir, your take on that whole scene?
Well, actually, with everything, I think, in this film, there are these two, everything is there in two versions, kind of positive and negative, threatening and kind of hopeful, because I've mentioned the other shack, which I know, on this sort of most stupid metaphoric level, or allegorical level, actually, perhaps, it's disintegrating this sort of relationship, perhaps, between these Ugo and Juliana. But especially with the ship, right, there is this, the contagion ship arrives in this scene that we're discussing now, right? And it's not the same ship, of course, but, towards the end of the film, we've got another ship which is presented as this sort of deathly kind of whatever object. Whereas this is juxtaposed against the, hopeful images of the ship. One is, of course, the sailing boat in this Sardinia sequence. But even if we exclude that, before they end up in the shack, this red shack, let's say, they're on the way, and Juliana is the only person who sees a ship sailing. It's shot in such, I don't remember, probably you remember this, it's shot in such a way that we don't see the canal.
Yeah.
Over which it's sailing.
It almost looks like one of those old ships floating on air, that the sailors will see.
And behind the trees, actually.
Yeah.
Right? There is a line of trees. So this is this ship. There's another ship, when this kid, pretends or whatever. It's never explained in the film, as usual. That, there's problems with the legs. She tries, be outside the flat. We see this white ship. It's not totally white, but Juliana tries to enter this kid so that, he forgets that he's faking or whatever. Look at this beautiful white ship, and so on and so forth. So we've got this, there are two kinds of ships. And, I also have a theory about this, actually. The ship Um, this Corrado appears in her. Actually, we also have a ship at the very beginning, in the credits scene, where it appears for the first time, actually. But I would actually connect the images of ships, including this fantasy scene, to Corrado, who kind of appears in her life in her husband's place. They have the relationship which is disintegrating like this shack, and there's this guy who appears on the horizon, so to speak, and he's about to go away to Patagonia, by the way, like a ship. But this guy has these two sides. I mean, within her fantasy, he functions as this white ship, which opens the world. Like in this fantasy, there is this sailing ship on the horizon. She goes there, it appears mysterious. It comes from outside, somewhere beyond the world, whatever, braving storms. It creates some kind of outside to her world, right? Whereas this Corrado is not an outside to her world, actually. He's just this, we've got this Max, who's this ruthless capitalist, and, he's like the same kind of guy, but like this romantic kind of capitalist who wants to go to Patagonia and sort of like bring all this world that we see in Italy, which I don't see very positively, unlike Antonioni, actually, and sort of like implement this in Patagonia, which is like the furthest away that you can go from Italy. It's like on the other side of the planet, exactly. So Patagonia means like everywhere, basically, right? So, well, I don't know. I can go on like this, but perhaps I should stop.
David, let's talk about the end of the film. Basically, it's one of these films that seemingly ends where it begins. She's with her son again. They're walking in this bleak landscape, and you get the sense that perhaps Corrado was just one of many men she has dallied with in the past and will dally with again. That she talks about. At the end, the birds know not to fly through the yellow smoke because it's bad for them. But you get the sense that Juliana, metaphorically, has her own deadly smoke, and she keeps walking into it, doing the same thing over and over again. Is that a valid interpretation of the ending, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of endings of, in fact, most endings of most Antonioni films, it's ambivalent. I mean, think of the ending of Blow Up, which is kind of mysterious, where they play the tennis game. The ending of L'Avventura, is that a reconciliation, or is it kind of the end of a relationship? So I don't think he meant this to be a kind of easy to read ending. And in fact, critics are divided on it. I mean, I'm sure Salome's got a reading of it as well, but a lot of critics read that statement that she makes at the end. Little boy Valerio, asks about the birds and the poisonous yellow smoke, and she says the birds learn to fly around the smoke. So one reading is, okay, Juliana is like the bird. She's learned to kind of make her peace with that world, and she's learned to kind of avoid its negativity. Other people don't read it that way. I mean, there's an article by Robin Wood in Movie in 1965, where he said that that ending shows you're in the same place as you were at the beginning. She's with the Valeria again. She's standing out there. She hasn't really made any progress. It's like in a loop. So we loop back to where we were at the beginning. Okay, she says the birds avoid the poisonous smoke. It doesn't mean that I'm able to do that. So yeah, I see it as open-ended really, and it's not a hard conclusion.
Slawomir, what is your take on the ending?
My take on ending is also ambivalent, but in a different way. I mean, that he returned to the same place that we were at the beginning of the film. For me, it sort of like ties into two things, more than two, but two. Okay, let's just talk about two. I mean, it's the place of the strike. This is one thing, at the beginning of the film. We had a strike there, and another important motive in the film. I mean, strike was not an important motive in the film. I mean, okay, but an important motive of the film are colors. I mean, colors in the sense that we've got the scene that in extreme anxiety, colors attack Juliana, for instance, right? I mean, in the Corrado hotel, the hotel in which Corrado stays, for instance, right? And we've got these, flaming red walls in the shack, and so on and so forth. And I would associate this. Again, that would need a longer argument, but okay, on the one hand, of course, color is used to a certain extent in this film in a kind of abstract way, but not only, I would say. And I would associate colors and this, and I've already said this actually before, with excitement, right? Excitement of which this new word is supposed to offer, but anxiety is also an excitement. It is excitation in a way too. And you might remember that in two last shots, as far as I remember, first we see Juliana against some blurry background, and they're like blurs of color, basically. But then, and I think this is the last shot of the film, these blurs kind of reconstitute itself into nitric acid, like a brightly colored containers. And there's this sort of like acido nitrico plaque or something on next to them, or something like this. Right? So this nitric acid, well, what makes for the ambivalence here, I would say that on the one hand, well, as far as I'm concerned, colors are very much associated with excitation, which is Juliana's nemesis, you can say. Right? But because this also appears in the place of the strike, I don't know, I would even go to such an extent and perhaps connect this somehow with this possible connection of this acid to the strike, or some kind of collective which is beyond the word that we've been shown throughout this film, in which 1 + 1 = 1. You might remember there is this scene in which Hugo teaches his son that 1 + 1 = 1, right? We always end up with an individual, a one, whatever, there is no collective, right? And I don't know, it's 1964, and 1968 is just around the corner, so why not? Why not connect these two, the acid to the strike?
So let me just talk about let's talk about the legacy of the film, both what Antonioni did later and how this film has been perceived. Several times, at least 3 times, I think, we were talking about dystopia, that the word dystopia is floated about. And I think a lot of that has been added afterwards. And I think of 3 films that are vaguely could be called science fiction where this comes from. And I think it comes from the smokestack scene. 4 or 5 years later, after this, there was a children's film called Godzilla's Revenge here in the U.S. about a young Japanese boy who was a latchkey kid in the hellscape of industrialized Japan, and while qualitatively it's not in the league with this film, there's also this sense of detachment and alienation. Fast forward to 1982, and there's a scene in Blade Runner that opens up with the fire belching smokestacks, and it gives this sort of steampunk atmosphere. And then go forward to the end of the 20th century, 97 or 98, there was a film called Dark City, which was also a nightmarish dreamscape that had these sort of anachronistic mixture of eras. And there were also these smokestacks when the characters fly up at the end and have their final battle. And a lot of steampunk TV shows, sci-fi entities seem to use this kind of imagery of fire belching smokestacks, And I think it all goes back to the smokestacks in this film, which is odd. And I think people, because they now associate dystopia with that kind of imagery, when people who've seen those films first look back at this film, they naturally associate it with dystopia. What do you think of that, David?
Well, it's fascinating. I don't know Godzilla's Revenge. Of course, I know Blade Runner, and I can see that connection. You know, the flames shooting up. As you know, I think first time I saw it, I thought, "Wow, that's Red Desert."
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm pretty sure that use also of washed out color and darkness is, you know, drawing on that tradition of you know, playing around with color that in some ways you might say is initiated by Antonioni in '64. But rather than talking about the kind of legacy of the dystopian imagery, I would also want, you know, because we're kind of coming towards an ending, I think, I just would also like to put in a word for, you know, what I see as Antonioni's fascination with the abstraction of colour. You know, whatever you think about the narrative of the film or the meaning or its relationship to industrial modernity, he is very engaged with contemporary art and abstract art. You know, we know that this playing around with, you know, putting things out of focus and patches of colour was something he wanted to do in that film. And I think there is a narrative meaning of it. I mean, when things go out of focus, that's also Giuliano kind of not registering, not being in focus. So there is a connection with the, you know, the anxiety disorder character. But it's also, I think, Antonioni's fascination with doing these things with colour, with doing something that's like a painting. You know, there's I don't know, there's so many sequences start on a shot where the characters aren't in shot, like the scene in Via Alighieri where she shows him the shop she's trying to set up with the pots of paint lying around, starts with a still shot on a wall, which is a kind of peeling wall. And then you get other shots, you know, and other sequences where it starts on a piece of, I don't know, industrial building or a wall or something like that, then the characters move into it. So I think that, you know, that constant engagement with the abstraction of space and colour is something that he, you know, is an important part of the film, however you want to read its narrative significance. There's an essay which I think I quote in my commentary that Slabum has mentioned by Matthew Gandhi, who's an environmental geographer, cultural geographer, who talks about what he calls deliquescence in this film. You know, things dissolving. Deliquescence, you know, it just means when solids melt into liquids, or, you know, they dissolve. And he says that, you know, where something seems solid and it dissolves away, like in The Fog and the end of the sequence in the shack, where, you know, they get lost in the fog. Bodies kind of disappear in those colours. You know, he's playing around with that, and I wouldn't want to read that simply as something functional to the narrative about, you know, the negativity of industrial modernity. I think it's, you know, him a real fascination with doing something abstract. You know, this film is like other films of Antonioni. I'm thinking of the end of Zabriskie Point, for instance, you know, with that house exploding. Yeah. But he's, you know, he's playing on the edge between narrative cinema and art cinema, or, you know, narrative cinema and avant-garde film. It slips into being an avant-garde film about colour. And I think that, you know, indeterminacy of it is something that I find very interesting about it. It's not I see a weakness in the film. It's one of its strengths.
So before we ask you both to summarize why you think this is a great film, let me end with Sławomir with this question. The legacy within Antonioni's work, do you see Red Desert as sort of the pivot in his work from the earlier films to later films like Blow Up, Zabriskie Point, Passenger, which were done with English speaking roles, but also this seems to be a central film that has sort of one foot on the dock and one foot on the boat. What is your take, Sławomir, on that?
I agree, actually, because and I would, as I said, I mean, this is the last film with a female character, but it's a different female character from his earlier female characters. And just to add to what David said before, you know, his use in color in this particular film is unique. I mean, his later films are also in color, but the color is never used in such a way. I mean, in this sort of like, let's call it abstract and, you know, play with abstraction. That's the only film in which he really does this to such an extent. And this makes it kind of unique in his work.
Yeah.
And also, I think that it's also this, and that's also why I try to push it in this political direction. I mean, the interpretation, because I think that this also is a transitional film, but also, as you said, a pivotal film in the sense that Antonioni's later films, I mean, these English-speaking films, are. Well, I think his earlier films are also political, but in a more kind of clandestine way. And his later films, for Madrigal du Maire especially, because, Identificazione della Donna it isn't a political film, but these later films are much more explicitly political. And I think it kind of, like this transition also kind of shows in this film. Although it's not perhaps, it's on the surface, but most people don't see it. I don't know why.
So let me start with you, Sławomir. For someone who has never seen Antonioni or this film specifically, why is Red Desert a great film and why should they watch it?
Because it looks great and it's very different from anything that you've ever seen. I don't know. It's enough, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I agree. It's a unique film, and as you say, it's unique really in his canon. He never does anything experimental with color again. He doesn't really engage directly with the industrial landscape again in this way. There's a lot of desert in this film. If you think the desert sequence or the desert in Zabriskie Point, much maligned film by critics, hated by most American critics, actually a very interesting film. It's about the tension between desert and modernity. Again, it ends with a house exploding in the desert. So I think it's a unique film in his canon. I don't know. I don't want to be evaluative, but let me be evaluative. I think it's one of his best films. It's certainly most engaging for audiences. It doesn't have the narrative pull or blow up, or the passenger. Those of them have much stronger storylines. This is why I think, in a way, it doesn't rely so much on narrative. The story itself is quite thin, but it does. It's unique in many. It's a unique film, not just for Antonioni, and this, as I say, is straddling the boundary between avant-garde experimentation and narrative cinema. That's what I see as about it.
Well, Sławomir and David, thank you for spending an hour or so talking about this film. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. I've learned a lot also from listening to Sławomir, so it's been fun. Thank you very much.